so many of you online already. As ever, we're recording this webinar for the purposes of putting it on our YouTube channel. And then, if you don't mind me doing some self-promotion, IRCT Communications, which I lead, will turn the webinar into a series of question and answers, which we'll use to put out on social media and remember all the best points made here. So perhaps by way of short introduction and in classic British fashion, I can start with an apology. I'm sure all of you have got used to the wonderful presence of Berta Soleil hosting these webinars. Berta Soleil is away in the US at the moment. So it falls to me, Hugh MacLeod, the communications lead, to take you through this, our third webinar in our series on sexual torture. Just getting everybody into the webinar now. I'll introduce our panelists, our presenters. But before I do, the reminder that we've got simultaneous translation, Spanish and French. You can click on the channel at the bottom of the page. That's the globe icon. And of course, we really want this to be a participation for the audience. We want everyone to ask questions, to learn new things, to share knowledge. That's really the main part of these webinars. So please, if you have a question, you can raise your hand with the little button also at the bottom. It's on the icon reactions. Yeah. And then you can ask a question also in the chat. And with your question, we will come to you and we'll ask you to open the microphone, ask one of our panelists the question, or share your experience. So today we're joined from Mogadishu by Dalmar Dhayow. He's Secretary General of IRCT's newest member, the Coalition of Somali Human Rights Defenders. From Physicians for Human Rights, one of the key authors of the Istanbul Protocol, which we're discussing today in terms of what it says about sexual torture and disclosure and documentation. We have Payal Shah. She's the director of the program on sexual violence in conflict zones. And she will share experience of training and building capacity for supporting survivors of sexual torture. From Kosovo, we are joined by the always busy, now even more so, as she celebrates the 25th anniversary of the incredible organization she founded. That's IRCT member Kosovo Rehabilitation Center for Torture Victims, another long title in our acronym heavy sector. And that's Feride Rushiti. And finally, from Physicians for Human Rights, also we have Ranit Mishori, who is adjunct professor of family medicine at Georgetown University in Washington, DC, in the US, and is now a member of Physician for Human Rights Advisory Council. So, just before we begin, because I've done this in my role doing some law lectures and things for undergraduate students, and I'm sure all of you are more qualified than that. But what I have always found is lots of people don't have the primary texts when we discuss things. So I would like to just share in the chat and guide you to the Istanbul Protocol. Let me see if I can post my own message here. Here we are at the IRCT's website. You can download it from there, and we can actually all take a look together, either in PDF or if you have your printed version, and we'll just do an overview of what the Istanbul Protocol actually says about disclosure and documentation of sexual torture, because that is the title of this webinar, although we will expand outwards. The second resource I would just like to point you towards, and this is rather self-interestedly of me as the communications lead, but it's our YouTube channel. where you will find not only insights, not only survivors speaking out, not only wonderful videos about livelihoods and all the rest of the things we do, but also the webinars. And you'll see there the first 2 webinars we've already done on sexual torture. The first one was understanding what it is, what it isn't. And then the second was the stigma issue around sexual torture and obviously disclosure. So what we've covered in those webinars, I will try not to go over again, because I imagine many of you are coming back from having been to those already. And the third thing would be the report by Dr. Alice Edwards, once of Torture Journal Advisory Council, now the Special Rapporteur on Torture, as you all know. She has done the first uniquely thematic report on sexual torture by a UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. And I would just like to kind of frame our coming conversation around some of just a couple of points that she's raised in that report. So, if I may, I can just take us to the call to action, which she has towards the end of her report, page 19, where we're framing the understanding of sexual torture in terms of moving away from prosecution, or maybe not away, but we're saying that rape and other sexual violence can and should be prosecuted and investigated as torture. And there's some really good reasons she puts out in her report, because it removes that unnecessary question of consent, because we have this binding legal framework. Whether you've ratified the Convention Against Torture, it's a jus cogens, it's a part of international law binding on all states. And I think there's some very interesting points she makes in this report about why it's a very good thing for the anti-torture movement to focus on sexual violence as this form of severe psychological, physical suffering. And then in this call to action, there's a couple of really important things, I think, for our discussion. Calling out torturers and raising the voices of survivors. So whether we're doing full-blown medical legal evaluations, which are always the sort of the pinnacle of the Istanbul Protocol's work, or we're doing testimonials, which in my purposes as the communications lead here, I do quite a lot of those. And in my previous career as a journalist, I interviewed a lot of people who'd been subjected to sexual torture and didn't understand really the ways to do it at the time. Lots of journalists don't have specific training. So I think it's really important that we understand it's not only for psychiatrists, forensic experts, that if you're working with survivors of sexual torture, the IP is still for you. Even if you are simply getting the complete picture, getting the story from the survivor, and you're not doing a full-blown medical legal evaluation with all the physical evidence gathering and other forensics. And that rehabilitation, which obviously is IRCT's basis for operations, is mandated under the Convention Against Torture. So if we put survivors of sexual violence, rape, other crimes as survivors of torture, then we also have that mandate obligation on states and perpetrators to rehabilitate them, which doesn't exist actually in other areas of international law necessarily. So without without too much further ado, I would like to invite then Ranit Mishori to take us through what the Istanbul Protocol says a little bit, perhaps in conversation with myself, because I haven't asked panelists to prepare any presentations. But Ranit, if you can unmic and take the screen.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Great.
perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So the Istanbul Protocol, of course, the first version was groundbreaking in terms of the idea of standardizing the way that we collect evidence from survivors of torture for the purpose of justice mechanisms. And the 2022 update really delved a little bit more deeply into areas that were not covered as well in the original version, and namely part one of them was sexual violence and sexual torture, and the other part, more specifically, is an evaluation, the evaluation of children. But you know, I think one of the great benefits of the Istanbul Protocol is the ability to structure the way we do these evaluations. And I speak as a physician from the medical legal perspective. This is a skill. It's an acquired skill. Every health professional can acquire this skill. This is not something that's unbelievably difficult, but you do need to be trained in how to do that. And the reason is that this is very different from a regular physical examination when you document physical and mental health signs for the purpose of a medical diagnosis or for the purpose of treatment. There are differences between these two types of processes and procedures. And, you know, it's not a surprise that health professionals around the world, when they go to medical school or nursing school or other types of school, are not trained in how to collect the evidence in such a way that would help the objectives of the Istanbul Protocol, which include having evidence that is admissible in court for justice mechanisms, among other objectives. And so when we, and Payal can talk about it a little bit more, when we train health professionals in working with the Istanbul Protocol as the framework, we see that there's more of a standardization in the way that they interview survivors of torture and sexual torture, and that there's a standardization in the way that it's documented and written up. And there's a very, very specific purpose here. It's not that a health professional can say, I saw that survivor of sexual torture and I certify that that person had undergone what they purport to have undergone. The whole notion of the Istanbul Protocol is the corroboration of the clinical findings, be their physical findings, be their mental health findings, and the narrative of the survivor or the patient, depending on the context in which you see them. And so it is a way of bringing the two together and saying that as an expert, as a medical professional, as a health professional, it is your opinion, after years of training, that you can corroborate the consistency of the narrative of the individual with your physical findings. And we find that, at least when I've trained hundreds, if not thousands, of professionals all over the world in assessing survivors of torture and survivors of sexual torture through this framing. And oftentimes, there's a concern about, am I going to be able to do it? Am I going to be able to do it right? Oftentimes I hear people say, well, what about re-traumatization? Maybe we shouldn't do it. That is from my personal view, is that I think, while I 100% agree that re-traumatization is a risk, I think sometimes we use that to avoid going through the process. Oftentimes, in my experience assessing torture survivors, sexual torture survivors, is that oftentimes they do want to tell their story, and there is a therapeutic element to undergoing this evaluation and the documentation. So we train physicians how to do this in a way that is trauma-informed. There's a trauma-informed way of doing the interview. There's a trauma-informed way of doing the physical examination, and then putting this all together in a consistent and standardized approach that uses standardized language to say what it is that they can't say. They can't say this person was raped. You weren't there, you can't say it. But there is a way of saying their scars, their mental health manifestations are consistent or highly consistent with the stories that they allege happened to them. So that's essentially the general overview and framing of the Istanbul Protocol. And I'll stop right here.
Great, thanks. Well, should we just do a little, because we do have a bit of time, should we go over just some of the really key points that are made in the protocol? As you say, there's this avoidance question, and here we're at sort of, it starts at paragraph 274 with people following through. Obviously, in many cases, you know, a survivor of sexual torture is initially, and perhaps for years, going to want to avoid talking about it. And I think in previous webinars, there's a lot of discussion about why that would be. But then there was this, picking up on what you said there, interesting concept of avoidance from the clinician or the interviewer themselves, you know, that actually the IP mandates clinicians to not avoid, you know, doing this work because of their own feeling, this is going to be traumatic, or this is a very hard subject for me to deal with. So I think there's some useful guidance in there.
Yeah, if I may jump in here, you know, sexual torture is a particular type of torture that is extremely difficult to talk about. And it's not just by women, it's not just by men, but there are differences along gender lines. There are differences according to where you come from and cultural norms in which you grew up in, and how easy it is to talk about general sexual matters, talk about the anatomy of a male, female, non-binary people. You know, it's even in the regular medical assessment without torture, it's very difficult for a lot of patients to talk about that. And it's also sometimes difficult for clinicians to talk about that, to bring this up, let alone when it's part of the worst day or period of time that somebody has gone through this kind of experience. So there are issues of shame, there are issues of fear, there are issues of stigma, cultural issues, and of course those go both ways. They're all on the part of the survivor and on the part of the clinician who's trying to get this testimony. So part of the standardization is, how do you ask these questions in a way that is least troubling to the individual? Is it about trauma-informed practices, but also it's about trying to normalize this as much as you can normalize sexual torture. But for example, if you think about a person you're seeing in front of you who may not be disclosing this, but you know that they're in a custodial setting where oftentimes sexual torture occurs, you know, there's a way of asking the question. For example, I know that we hear, or throughout my career, I've heard of many people in your situation who have had experiences involving their genitalia. Did anybody ever touch your genitals in a way that you, somehow wasn't right in your mind? And so part of the training specifically on sexual torture is training the clinicians on how to ask these very difficult questions. They're never fun to ask. 9 out of 10 times, survivors don't want to disclose. And there are all kinds of different techniques of interview techniques. There are physical examination techniques to ask them, and specifically also not assuming that at the end of this visit or at the end of the assessment, that if they didn't disclose, that it didn't happen, and then coming back to it in a way that is as gentle as possible, that is less stigmatizing as possible. But there are many, many reasons why these stories are not told. Ultimately, you can't you can't squeeze it out of anyone who doesn't want to talk about it. And sometimes people don't want to talk about it because the risk to their psyche is too great, and you have to go along with that. You cannot force it out of anyone who doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as a former journalist, perhaps still a journalist and now lawyer of sorts, who did some advocacy training for the English and Welsh courts, at least, some of the questioning techniques in the IP are really, really interesting because they are the same you would use in a primary, in a first interrogation of a witness in court. You can't ask leading questions. You don't say, so you were tortured, or, oh, so tell us about the rape. There's things like, did the officers ever remove their clothes? That's an open question that doesn't need to go anywhere, but it gives the space to the survivor to actually share their information. And then a more kind of clinical approach I saw in paragraph 458, in case anyone is truly following the IP as we go through, an inquiry about such symptoms as part of body systems review by the doctor can lead to disclosure of the assault, the sexual assault. Because you can talk about, do you have problems urinating? Do you have problems?
And this was the biggest
part of a wider, yeah.
This was the biggest lesson learned for me in the early days of me doing these evaluations. I encountered a journalist in a country in Southeast Asia who was alleged he was tortured and was giving this very, very detailed and straightforward narrative and disclosed what happened. But at the end of the visit, I forgot to do what's called the review of systems. He gave me so much information there already about how he was kidnapped and beaten and all of that stuff. And at the end, I almost didn't do it. And I said, okay, can we just do a review of systems? And it wasn't until I did a full review of systems, which is part of a routine part of a medical examination. And when I asked about his GI system, so gastrointestinal, and then he disclosed that he sometimes has what's called fecal incontinence, and that immediately raised a red flag. He did not disclose it initially. And so only through going through this, and I thought, okay, why would anyone of a relatively young age have fecal incontinence? He was about 50 years old at the time. And that took the whole investigation and evaluation into a different pathway. And indeed, he was sexually tortured while in prison with, I'm not going to describe the horrifying things that he was made to undergo, but that is one of those things that you have to be systematic. There has to be a standardized way of approaching these issues, because otherwise you may not identify them at all.
Thanks, Ranit. I see we have hand up from Andres Gautier. Hi, Andres. Very nice to see you again.
Buen día a todos. Y gracias por su presentación, Ranit. Yo pienso que cuando se habla de las personas temen a la retraumatización, puede esconder muchas cosas. Y yo pienso que eso vale para el médico como para el psicólogo. No es solamente una formación técnica de preguntas, sino tratar su propia subjetividad. Si el profesional no está preparado emocionalmente por su historia, y muchos de nosotros, es un tema complejo para nosotros mismos, necesita espacios de formación donde su propia subjetividad está escuchada, atendida, la subjetividad del profesional. Es una ilusión resolver el problema con temas puramente técnicos.
Andres, thank you so much for raising this issue. And this is one of the areas I'm most passionate about. And I know at PHR, we try to incorporate that into every training, is the idea of vicarious trauma, and whether you're ready or not to hear what the survivors tell you. And many times you're not, or it affects you in a way that you need to take a break. But to your point, we're all human, and many of us in the health professions have undergone trauma ourselves. In fact, I've done a study of the PHR network maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and we saw that women and people who do this work for a longer period of time are more at risk for this vicarious trauma. If you look at statistics about how many women and even men are in their own regular lives, not being torture survivors, experienced sexual trauma or sexual violence, it would be very, very difficult to be a survivor of sexual violence yourself and then come and assess a survivor of sexual torture. So in the training, we talk about that. I would absolutely recommend for those of you or of us who are survivors of trauma ourselves to think very, very deeply about how engaged we want to be in this work and what kind of cases we are willing to take, because we're not going to heal through these encounters. It's not fair to the survivors, and we have a responsibility to them and to ourselves. Thank you for raising this issue, Andres.
Yes, thank you. And just from IRCT's perspective, Care for Caregivers, we've previously done a webinar, and I've then turned that into a shorter insights piece. I've just shared that on the chat with everyone. It's kind of a question and answer. Some of it's going to be quite obvious to practitioners such as yourselves, but it's also there to share with anyone in your networks who understands there's going to be stresses on their staff, but may not know the signs to look out for, or the kinds of different symptoms and things that exist there. And it's in Arabic now as well, so because the Middle East is certainly in need of some care for caregivers. So we have avoidance from survivor and clinician. Risk of re-traumatization, that's very clear. And in terms of what sexual torture is, what it's not, we've covered that in the first webinar, but there are parts of the IP that set things out in as much detail as you could need. I think there's some very important things about the trust that is necessary to build in what can be a relatively short amount of time with a survivor of sexual torture. And I think the first part of that, as it sets out in paragraph 459, the privacy, you know, the physician or even the journalist or lawyer doing an interview or a medical examination with a survivor has to make sure that they understand that the details, the information they're giving, personal information, will always remain confidential until that survivor wishes it to not remain confidential. And then the specific consent that's required. I don't know whether anyone, Ranit or anyone else actually in the webinar can tell us about it. Have you been able to draft specific consent forms for survivors of what we call sexual torture? And how might they differ from consent forms for survivors of other forms of torture or serious trauma?
I'm happy to jump in just to say that the setting goes beyond the privacy. So sometimes we do these evaluations, first of all, in detention settings, where you can assume there's zero to no privacy. So you have to think about how you structure that. Sometimes it's even if there's full privacy. So for example, if I bring survivors to my clinic, if their sexual torture was in a setting that may look like a clinic, for example, which sometimes happens in detention facilities for people, you know, who are deprived of liberty, in all kinds of settings that may resemble the whiteness or the you know, minimalism of a medical office. Sometimes you have to think about that and move it to another location just to make people more at ease with this. I think consent is consent, as long as you do a good job going through the process of explaining what the risks are. Maybe the risks of disclosure of sexual torture are a little different because of the heavy cultural associations and shame and stigma. So if, again, but if a person does not give you consent, that's the end of it, and you have to respect that. So I think I don't see a different, we don't have different forms for sexual torture versus any other torture. But it's also important, and we do this in PHR training, is to train clinicians how to obtain consent in a trauma-informed manner. What are the things that you need to involve? Again, this is all standardized again, so to make sure that you cover everything and you really describe to the survivor the potential for harm for themselves if this information comes out. So again, it's its own process, but I don't personally, and if anyone else has a different approach, I don't personally see it as a completely separate type of consent.
Maybe I can jump in a little here, and I totally, of course, agree with you, Ranit. I think some of the things that we do sometimes think about is consent to what use of the information, and so can the information be disclosed to the national legal system? Can it be disclosed to an international mechanism that's doing fact finding? So I think those are some of the questions that come up. I think that, the flip side of this is also that one thing we do see quite a lot of is also this kind of presumption that you can coerce or force, or you should be coercing or forcing a survivor to go through a forensic examination. I think there's often a drive for accountability in certain contexts. So for example, in a context like Ukraine, where there is a big commitment to accountability by the government, I think there's often, I think, a feeling that, okay, if a judge has told me as a physician I need to do a forensic examination, that I then need to push the survivor to actually consent to the forensic examination. And that itself can be incredibly harmful. And so there's a dimension there that is also a piece that I think is sometimes a tripping point for documentation for survivors, where you see that a process that could be potentially healing, ends up kind of turning into something that is harmful when there is a presumption that actually a survivor needs to be coerced, to go through with this exam, in part because a clinician may also feel that the judge is directing them to intervene. And this is part of the reason that we often think about how, building good practices and documentation of sexual torture requires more than just training clinicians, although training clinicians is obviously a critical aspect. It also requires training these other sectors. Because ultimately, right, there is an order that's going to come from the judge, and a clinician is going to feel that it is their responsibility to comply with that order, and pushing back at that is difficult. It's not an easy or straightforward thing. And so I think that's another area where there's quite a lot of work to be done. So PHR actually just recently has been completing a project in Iraq where we've been working on helping develop a combined standardized medical legal documentation form for sexual violence and torture, really recognizing that these violations happen on a continuum. And part of what we found was that the clinicians were saying, hey, okay, we have this form, this is great, but actually, until you can get the judges to let us give more than just the answer, is the hymen intact? Is this person a virgin? We actually cannot do much with this. And so, the next step is then building that dialogue and that kind of, shared understanding across with the judiciary as well. And so that's been a big part of our project now, is then engaging with the Supreme Judicial Council and really thinking about how we can support a shared set of terminology, a shared set of language and understanding of each other's roles, and also really an understanding of the myths and misconceptions that can undermine the collection of comprehensive evidence and evidence that's collected in a way that is survivor-centered and trauma-informed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Payal. Those conflicting professional obligations are always such an interesting and difficult subject. And the IP does have some guidance on those early on, page 39, in case anyone's really geeking out and following through. Paragraphs 173. Yeah, the primary obligation is to the patient, to the client in cases of lawyer. But you can also face those difficult times when you seem to have conflicting obligations to society and justice or the court. I see, Feride, you have your hand up. let's go to you, and perhaps we can segue, because we are just about half an hour into our webinar. Perhaps we can transition to your presentation about the work of KRCT.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad being today with you and sharing another perspective beside the Istanbul Protocol on documentation of sexual torture cases. I prepared a short presentation with you, which I wanted to share. I wanted to contribute a little on the consent, which is so important in our situation, because when we established the database system, it was so important, beside having consent of survivors, also to discuss with the state authorities where those data will be saved and stored after organization is existing. In that period of time, when we start documentation, it was around 20 years after the wartime in Kosovo. So we're not in a position to collect any kind of forensic data, but a lot of testimonies and narratives from the victims. We were asked to have a kind of agreement with the Institute of Statistics in Kosovo in order to save and store those data when we as organization do not exist, or we do not have a mission anymore to work with this in this field. While now we have a new situation in a country level, because just this year it was established Institute of War Crime and Research and Documentation, which is in a position to collect data of all war crime, not only sexual torture, but survivors of sexual torture, but also other war crime. We are quite, it is a critical phase, because we already documented 1,300 cases, while in the consent, survivors didn't share, they consent to share the data with this institute, because this institute didn't exist when we started our documentation. We just start the dialogue with the institute, and we are still in a situation how we will proceed with sharing data, or what kind of data we could share, because also it's a huge work if we start to assess once again all survivors already are part of the documentation. And I would like to hear from all of you, maybe if you have similar situation, what was your lesson learned, or how you dealt in those kind of circumstances. Perhaps I would just share the presentation, and I would like to go very fast through my presentation and contribute more in the discussion.
Thanks, that's great.
Yes, as Henry mentioned, we just commemorated our 25 years of existence of our organization last week, and we were so glad to have also Lisa from IRCT contributing in one of our panels. So as organization, just for your information, we are composed from 5 pillars. The first pillar is dealing with holistic rehabilitation care, as majority of IRCT partners, I suppose, are having these sectors. Then human rights and advocacy. Under human rights and advocacy, beside that, we are doing a lot of the advocacy and changing policies. Also, we are monitoring close institutions, provide legal aid and counseling, and other activities. Under research and documentation, we are working a lot on research, clinical research, but also human rights research. And based on those research, then we change our policy of intervention, but also we use the research outcome to change, to advocate for policy change. The last sector is, I'm just trying, okay, is documentation. Under the documentation, we start already 20 years after the war to document survivors of sexualized torture, because it was in a period of time that we operate just working with this group. It was a lot of stigma surrounding this group. There was a taboo topic after the war, a lot of glorification about the martyrs, invalids, other war group, while the space for this group, it was shrunk, and it was not able even to be discussed through the NGO. So we had it first to work in destigmatization, and still it's present, trying to influence public and political discourse in order to bring this group in the law, and later want to start with the documentation. Under the transitional justice component, we work on reparation of wartime We also support survivors to access to justice and right to knows. So why we started the documentation? Maybe let's come to the topics that we are here now. The purpose of documentation in our situation was to establish the truth, because as I said, there was a lot of stigma and taboos and prejudice towards this crime, and different narratives were confronted. So we wanted to establish the truth, also support survivors for justice, as well as recognition of survivors by law, by one state mechanism. So we reached to bring different groups in this platform, which is built from our organization. It's led from KRCT, but we have also 3 other organizations who are working closely with survivors of sexualized torture. Then we secure, through this documentation, we secure legal and social recognition of survivor sexual violence in conflict, enable survivors to access reparation compensation schema, while advocating also for legal reform and policy addressing of conflict-related sexual violence, or I can call it survivor sexualized torture. Pursue justice for survivors through the legal mechanism, acknowledge the suffering endured by survivors, and combat stigma associated with sexual violence, which is still present, I have to say, in our society. Even there are some positive and progress in this field, there is still to be done in the level of family and community. To cover the truth or uncover the truth and challenges for those who deny this crime, because after the wartime, as I said, there was a lot of glorification of other war categories, while this kind of marginalized group was completely invisible, and there was no recognition by laws or by state institutions. To develop program for rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors, educate future generation, and raise awareness to local, regional, and international level. And we already shared our documentation platform with organizations from Ukraine, from Colombia, from Iraq, Guinea, who started reparation recently. To support and promote academical research on the use of sexual violence as a weapon of the war, and to contribute, hopefully, in prevention of sexual violence as a weapon of the war. Then here, some kind of preparation phase. We still, in order to establish documentation or archives or registry of survivor sexual torture, we had it first to have some internal procedure development. So we draft internal procedure, because the data of sexualized survivors of sexual torture, they are classified data in our countries. So therefore, each organization who dealt with documentation had to establish a data protection policy, which requests different profile, metallic box, saving procedure, and also people who were, or staff members who were involved in such a process. Then we developed a relevant questionnaire for data collection and processing, building the database, team preparation, as you mentioned, training is so important, and then consent form to develop for the survivor. Consent form had to be referred under the data protection law, because, as I said, there is those data are classified data, and we had to very specifically to establish the consent form, as well as we had a separate sheet for the information letter about their rights. So this was both for those who was interviewing survivor, but as well as for the survivor who entered in the process. Here is just one part of the format or questionnaires that we develop, but later on I will try to go and bring in categories how we develop the database. As you know, worldwide, I mean, in Kosovo and in the region, there was an initiative to establish a Truth Commission, Regional Truth Commission initiative from different organizations in the region. However, because sensitivity of those data, and it's very hard to collect information from this sensitive group, this kind of regional initiative mainly dealt with the human losses and with people who were civilian of the war, while survivors of sexualized torture were somehow left out or left behind, and they were not part of this initiative. So therefore, we decided to also to confront those narratives, but in the same time to give the space to establish the truth in Kosovo. We start to develop the database, which was quite hard, I have to say, because we didn't have so much experiences, and we tried really to see how we could have this database as a registry for survivors in order to serve them for different purposes, as I mentioned in the beginning. So in the first chapter is, as usually, is demographic data, then incident data, starting from a period, because in the Kosovo laws, we have certain legal framework that we had to follow. Then methods and forms of violence, health consequences, professional and service provided if they added any kind of support, social aspect, living condition, number of family members, in order to see how we could support them in the social aspect, access to justice, status recognition, alternative question. In the alternative question, we had a separate chapter when we give it a chance to survivors to ask question or to bring information to the database what we didn't consider as a question, because sometimes, even though we try to create those comprehensive database with a lot of question and information, we might forget something, and survivors had a chance then by themselves to bring certain information if they wanted to share with us. Where we are right now. Right now we have we established for 1 year. I think in 2019 was a time when we established around 1 year the database. From now and then we have around 1,300 cases documented by KRCT and our partners. Who are our partners? They are licensed partners who are recognized by state, as we are also Medica Kosovo, Center for Promotion of Women's Rights, and Medica Jakova, who already are working and providing service to the conflict-related sexual violence. Maybe some data. Here we have a woman and men. As you can see, a majority are disproportionately, of course, women and girls who were target of survivors of sexual violence during the war in Kosovo, but as well as we have some men. And those kind of figures do not represent the whole population of survivors of sexualized torture, because we are still in the process of collecting new data. Then we had age of the survivors. Under age of survivors, as you can see, we have around, I think, 16% age under 70, which means that they were a young generation or children were attacked as well. And this support us to develop different policies in terms of livelihood engagement, because majority of the survivors after the rape, life changed drastically. Majority of them, they were unable to be educated or to be integrated in society. So this support us to address different policy in the state level, but also as organization to create separate programs. And then next slide is nationality of the survivors. As I said in the beginning, there were different confrontation about the narrative, whether they were only Kosovo Albanian raped or we had it. So as you can see, we had it also some other minority who were who were attacked during the wartime, as a Bosniak, Roma, Ashkali, Egyptian, and one Serbs. And this is so important also to show and to give voice to all community who were affected as a weapon of the war during the wartime in Kosovo. Here we have a geographical region having this kind of yes.
That is the torture.
Oh, someone has their mic open.
Yes.
So, sorry.
Okay. So we have
also,
also, yeah, we have also some geographical region which do not represent the clear picture, because still we are collecting the data, but geographical region are giving us information how to orient our outreach activities in order to be as much as possible near to the community we are working. Here we have cities and villages. As you may see, rural area was much more attacked in this kind of sample we have right now in database, while cities, we have less numbers. Perhaps there are more, but perhaps in the cities, survivors had it much more chance to be integrated in society. We have still to analyze this data, but also from the narratives we already collect, it seems that the villages were much more attacked because also the confrontation in the war was much more oriented in the village rather than in the cities. Then we have repeated and group events. As you may see from those statistics, we have single events, we have repeated events, we had repeated events over a long period of time. And single events were quite a big events, which created a situation when survivors had it to ask for recognition. Recognition, maybe just for your information, because I want it to be as short as possible, but for your information, Kosovo didn't recognize, or there was kind of denial from institution due to the stigma and prejudice that this crime existed in our societies. For period of time, survivors of sexual violence were not recognized by any legislation. So as an organization, we led the process of legal recognition in 2014, 15 years late after the wartime. This group became recognized by law, and through recognition, they were entitled to have a personal pension as a compensation, as administrative reparation. Why we try to go with administrative reparation? Because in Kosovo, we had a UNMIC, UN administration body, who administrated Kosovo till 2007. This body didn't ensure any case didn't win justice. So while the later one we had it EU mission in Kosovo, unfortunately also during this period of time, any case didn't succeed in justice. Therefore, we wanted to advocate for legal recognition and to ensure some kind of reparation without going in a criminal procedure. So it's a separate mechanism. Survivors who go under legal recognition, there is a state commission, they go there, they provide some kind of narrative testimony, some legal, medical documentation, psychologist report, and through this kind of evaluation, they reach to have a monthly pension as a survivors of sexual violence.
I think that's such an important point, isn't it, Feride? Perhaps if I can just to sort of summarize that, because
yes,
I don't
I just wanted to bring in also the statistic, and because I have some more, so I can quit and I can contribute on this.
Sure, please finish them.
But here I just want to share it. So 77% of the survivors were raped in the presence of the family. What is this data showing? It's showing that it was not the purpose of perpetrator to rape only one person, but also exposing victims in the presence of family members and children. It impacted also family, and therefore, as an organization, we try also to provide support also to the family, because also they are impacted as well, and we had to interact also with the family. Then we have some data about children born as a product of rape. Let me see, maybe I can find it fast, where it is. Okay. Type of injuries, I am not stopping here, so I don't know which slide is. So maybe I'll just go, okay, so here. In our database, we have around 49 of them who already declared and shared with us the story that they had children as a product of the rape, which is a taboo topic, and it's not discussed at all in our society. Even we try to open as a perspective and just share it in different way or find a momentum. When we discuss in our organization with survivors as well as with family members, but also with some women caucus in parliament, apparently they responded there is not enough time, there is not momentum, so survivors would not like to share this kind of information. which for us is a big concern because it's so important those children to have some support and to be at least with kind of care separately as a family who are, beside they are having a lot of suffering from a rape time, they have also children who born. But those kind of information we are just gathering here, and when the time and momentum will be created, we are planning to advocate in order to give the voice also to this group. Then in the end, I just would like to pass all other data. In our database, we have a link when people could have some kind of basic information about the documentation. Of course, they cannot explore all information because due to the confidentiality, some data are closed. In the end, I just want to share with you, we just promoted for our 25th anniversary a manual for the methodology of documentation. I have to say that as an organization, we, maybe I can close, Adona, yeah. We contributed on the Nadia's Murad code. As you know, there is already now a code who is supporting worldwide activists, journalists, organizations how to collect the data about conflict-related sexual violence. But it was mainly brought some kind of principle. While we try to bring a manual from a perspective of methodology of documentation, from a field work. So in our manual, which we are willing to share maybe another time, we try to bring some experience how we have to interview the survivors, which is so sensitive and delicate, from an interview process, what we need to do and do's and don'ts. Then before the interview, during the interview, after the interview, also follow-up care and important consideration. There are different phases that we try to elaborate in order to not re-traumatize or trigger survivors, because sharing the stories after 25 years is not so easy. So therefore, we try really to collect all lessons learned during those years in order to use for our purpose as a network, but in the same time to share widely with all the networks, just to not re-traumatize and harm more survivors during the process of documentation. So this is it. Thank you, and I'm willing to contribute if you have any question or.
Thank you so much, Feride. And yes, please do share the documentation manual that you've put together. I mean, I think it's fair to say that KRCT may be one of the world's leaders in this field, because, you know, as you said, you've documented 1,300 cases. That's an extraordinary number. And I mean, just to put things in perspective for people that don't know KRCT, we're talking about local rights groups estimating somewhere around 20,000 women and some men being raped by Serb forces in Kosovo in just 1 year, basically, February 1998 to a year and a half, June 1999. And then the first person to speak out and put their own name to their sexual torture was this incredible lady, Vasfia Krasniki Goodman, who only spoke out in 2017, having been raped in 1999. So that gives you an idea about the barriers to disclosure. That's 17, 18 years. And in the interim, her rapists were indicted for that crime, but then acquitted by Kosovo's Supreme Court. That was in 2014. And she went through rehabilitation with KRCT. She was the first person in Kosovo to break that silence, you know, that decades-long silence. And then the second person also featured in self-promoting IRCT video, the amazing Shireta, who also told her story to us. And again, you can find them on our YouTube channel. And I just think it's really, really amazing, that example of documentation for the purposes of making a group actually visible. You know, these 20,000 survivors weren't even visible, right? They were just silent and unrecognized. And now they're legally visible and they're entitled to compensation. And I think sometimes, and being a lawyer, I'm part of the problem, we can focus a lot on the criminal litigation aspects of documentation. People are always like, well, this person's going to have to give an interview in court if they ever get there. And so what's the point of, you know, doing a full interview right now? But as we know that there's so much more to the process. It's not just for the sharp end of the wedge, which is the criminal prosecution, which occurs so very rarely anyway. It's for, you know, establishing the totality of the crime. As you say, these rapes were happening in front of family members. So it's not just an individualized experience, right? There's harm being done to many, many people. And it's not just one rape. It's a torture event which continues. Please go ahead. I see you.
And maybe I just would like just 2 minutes, not more than that. In the 25 years conference, in the end of the conference, we brought it a story of daughter of Feride, a survivors who mentioned by Henry. And the idea it was just that after 25 years to reflect also about impact of the torture to the family members, because Vanessa was only 4 years when her mother was raped in her presence. And she was able not to bring, because she was not able to elaborate, but just to bring her journey and how she opened the dialogue with her mother, how her mother was overprotecting her due to her experience, and then how she had some consequences. So we wanted just to give some light also to intergeneration trauma, which we did also with epigenetic study, but also having presence a daughter of the survivors just to share her journey with whole turbulences in her way and how mother and daughter supported each other in this journey. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And maybe just before I go to Andreas, who has another question, and then to Payal to talk to us about the training aspect of these standards that we have, the Murad Code, the IP, KRCT's experience. Bolbueni, you ask what are the practical strategies that you can contribute for the prevention of sexual violence in war? Well, I guess this documentation is one of those practical strategies in that you hope it has a deterrent effect. Obviously, it doesn't all the time, and it's very, very hard to measure. But there is always that purpose to torture documentation is the prevention and deterrence, as well as the after the event reparations and justice. So, Andreas, you had another question.
Gracias. Gracias, Feride, por toda la presentación, muy interesante, todo el aporte, todo el trabajo que hacen. Ahora tengo una duda. Cuando dijiste que cuando una persona viene, priorizan la documentación, si entendí bien. Por ejemplo, en Bolivia, con personas víctimas de tortura, nosotros nunca nos imaginamos priorizar una cosa, porque no hay que transformar la persona que ha sido víctima de nuevo en personaje pasivo. Es decir, si hay ganas de denunciar, está claro que ahí vamos a trabajar con el protocolo de Estambul. Pero si alguien está con su sufrimiento, con sus dolores, vamos a responder con psicoterapia. Porque lo importante es el rol activo, que él quiere retomar su vida, que ha sido robada, aniquilada. Entonces, ahí esa priorización de la documentación me deja un gusto un poco crítico. Por eso quiero preguntarte cómo lo ven ese problema. Es el primer punto. El segundo, me interesaría saber si han comparado la base de datos que tienen con la base de datos del IRCT, porque sería interesante ver qué aprender el uno del otro. Gracias.
Thank you, Andre. Indeed, documentation is a voluntary process. each and everyone who is part of the documentation, they have gone through the psychosocial or medical support. Maybe translation was somehow not so clear, but no, documentation, it came later after 20 years of existence as an organization. We already are working constantly on providing holistic rehabilitation to survivors. But also process of the documentation is empowerment process because they want to let the history somewhere as an ID format. So it is a parallel, and it's a precondition that survivors without having at least 6 months treatment cannot enter in a documentation because we are reopening the trauma event. So there is a precondition by the protocol I mentioned earlier. And I would like also to share our manual, which is clearly defined each stages how we do the documentation. But documentation is a parallel process, and it's a voluntary process for those who would like to share the stories. So it's just to contribute to the truth and to advance their rights, to amplify the voices, but it's not the first intervention we do to the survivors. In terms of IRCT, I think always it's a good proposal IRCT as a founder of our Kosovo Rehabilitation Center, we have, of course, to see how we could compare the data, how we could share, and how we can benefit from each other. And I look forward, and we are very open on that. But as an organization, we are quite open, and survivors have a leading process. Each and every policies and process are established in KRCT, but also policies and laws that we are aiming to change, they are based on the needs and requests survivors bring in the organization. Therefore, when we wanted to open the issue of children born of rape, which now worldwide getting some attention, when we sit with the survivor and discuss, they say to us, no. We get the same response from a family member, same response from MP, Women Caucus, and we just decided to treat in silence because there is not still a momentum for them. So it will come a time we have to see how we can bring this pain in the surface. So the voice and requests of survivors are making the philosophy of organization. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Feride. And thanks, Andres, for a very interesting question.
Thank you.
I think we'll turn to Payal,
Gracias a ti.
Physicians for Human Rights. Payal, perhaps you could reflect on our conversations so far and maybe just share some of your experiences from one of the world's leading, more medical-based, obviously, organizations documenting sexual torture.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm also seeing quite a lot in the chat as well to the risk to some survivors if they do come forward. And this is why I think all of us on the panel are really emphasizing again and again that it's very important that these examinations occur with full consent. They occur in a voluntary manner, that there's also these other supports that are in place so that a survivor isn't coming forward in a way that ends up ultimately endangering them or being forced to undergo an evaluation in a way that is re-traumatizing and itself can constitute a form of torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, depending on the circumstances. So I think this is something very important, and this is something the Istanbul Protocol itself is quite clear on. So there are a number of myths and misconceptions around documentation of sexual torture that I think the Istanbul Protocol really well lays out. And I think it's very important when we think about capacity building and training around doing documentation that we think about how we can use the moment, not just to teach a clinician how to walk through the different steps, but also to how to think through some of these myths and misconceptions which may undermine the ability to document evidence well and in a way that isn't re-traumatizing. And so some of these really include things like, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of being able to test virginity, or this idea that if somebody is not a virgin, that they could not be subject to rape. There's, the IP is really clear that forced hymen examinations to detect virginity and forced anal examinations of individuals to detect same-sex activity are examples of clinical examinations that have no clinical value, that represent forms of sexual assault and constitute ill treatment themselves and may amount to torture depending on the individual circumstances. And this is something actually that's been picked up by quite a lot of international human rights bodies that have also affirmed that this is a violation of rights. And there's been recognition by international forensics organizations as well of the unscientific nature. There's also myths and misconceptions that come up around the idea that children can't be trusted or women can't be trusted, that if there's inconsistencies in a story, that it means actually that the rape didn't happen or sexual torture didn't happen, when actually this can be a product of trauma as well. And so this is another area where I think the Istanbul Protocol is quite clear about these areas, these norms that really do undermine documentation, but are very important to be aware of. Beyond that, the Istanbul Protocol also specifically calls out the fact that many clinicians, and I think actually many judges, and I'm a lawyer, so I can critique the legal profession. I think many lawyers, they have this understanding that if there's no physical injuries, that means that no violence happened, no sexual torture happened. And yet, actually, again, as the clinicians on this call could tell you, a lot of sexual torture does not actually result in physical injuries specifically to the genital area. And by the time a survivor comes forward, those injuries may also have healed to the extent that they even existed. And so this is why it's both really important to do a full head-to-toe examination, because injuries may actually be elsewhere on the body, but also to do an examination that looks at the longer-term impacts, including psychological evidence, as well as evidence of longer-term health harm that can arise from sexual torture, including issues around urination, pregnancy, obviously, then STIs, fistulas, pain, sexual dysfunction, including fear of intimacy and other sort of hesitation around engaging in sexual activity or reproduction, the mental health impacts, including depression or self-harm. And so it's really important that the documentation takes into account that full breadth. And that's something, again, I think judges and lawyers not aware of either, never, in addition to clinicians. And so this is a myth that kind of spans across the entire pathway to justice for survivors. And then we also see this myth that if an exam has to happen within 72 hours, and it's something actually we hear quite a lot, especially in conflict contexts, where there is a feeling that if the examination hasn't happened within 72 hours, it's not worth doing an examination at all. And I think this, again, goes to that point of we need to actually understand that there is a lot of evidence that can be gathered around understanding if somebody has experienced sexual torture that can be useful and important for corroboration of a testimony, but it is not just that physical evidence. And then the second piece is that there tends to be an over focus on DNA evidence, which, DNA evidence can be important, but actually it is really not the most dispositive or only form of evidence. And actually in conflict contexts or in context of sort of mass atrocities, actually, we're not always also legally looking at the DNA evidence as the most important evidence, because we're not trying to link just to a perpetrator. We're actually thinking about the command responsibility, who was actually in charge of that group. And so it's actually things like the insignia on a uniform, the language being spoken by the perpetrator is equally, if not more, actually more important, because the DNA evidence is really about that individual perpetrator. And actually also it's so unlikely you'll have that match, right, to the DNA. The DNA is only useful if you can match it to a person, and in the context of military, that's not really something we can take for granted can happen. And so I think these are some of the just some examples. There's so many more that are myths and misconceptions that occur, but I think the Istanbul Protocol is actually quite comprehensive in thinking through some of these different ways in which documentation can be hindered. But it's not just the clinicians that need to learn this or be aware of this. It's actually, again, prosecutors, it's judges, and even looking outside of the criminal justice context, it's important for health systems in designing reparations and designing these medical interventions to support survivors to be able to understand the full breadth of harm. So some areas where PHR has been working to try to tackle this problem have been looking at developing standardized tools and forms, and that was something I think Dr. Mishori alluded to earlier, and I can share some examples. We also have been thinking about what it looks like to ensure systems that capacity is built before a crisis, rather than waiting until a conflict is happening and then after the fact, being able to do the documentation only 20 years later, which is still important, but obviously it's easier and it can be there are advantages to being able to do the documentation a little bit closer to the allegations. And then also thinking about the use of technology and how that can support documentation, and then how do we bring together sectors. So at PHR, we really start with developing multi-sectoral trainings. We do the trainings around forensic documentation with doctors and nurses and other clinicians, together with lawyers, with judges, and with police. And the idea is actually to create this clarity around roles and responsibilities, around terminology, and also to dispel some of these myths, right? And as I said earlier, like, for example, the myth that the hymen and the condition of the hymen is the evidence in sexual violence and sexual torture cases. And in fact, it is not. Not only it's not dispositive of whether sexual torture occurred, it also can lead to quite a lot of stigma if it's then conducted as virginity testing, and can itself be a form of torture, including things like the two-finger test, which has been recognized and banned actually in several countries. So I think that's one area. And so, for example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, PHR worked for many years together with clinicians, lawyers, law enforcement, and judges to co-create a forensic documentation form. And that documentation form is really looking at sexual violence, but walking clinicians through everything from consent to being able to lay out the kinds of questions that would capture different forms of sexual torture. So I know that was something, Hugh, you mentioned that has been covered in past webinars, but right, sexual torture is not just rape. It is important to say, because so many people think it is. And so it's really important that this form is asking these questions. It's also walking through the head-to-toe examination. It's also laying it out in a way that is trauma-informed. So really thinking about starting with the less intimate parts of the body, like a hand, and then working your way through so that you are not creating you're not starting right with something that you haven't had time, it gives you time to build rapport with the patient, with the survivor, and then it's also looking at asking questions around perpetrators, asking questions around what did the perpetrators say, what were they wearing, and these pieces are important because depending on the context, right? If it is a context of conflict, for example, or even in torture, it's important to understand some of these broader elements. And so to be able to capture that in this first encounter is helpful in order to not have to go back and interview again. So I know, Ranit, thanks so much for dropping the article. I was actually going to do that. And then also we have like a toolkit around the medical legal documentation form that I can also share in a moment in DRC. So that form took about 10 years to develop, but now that it's in place, I think it's been really important. And we're also working on developing practical guides, toolkits, and we have some that are already out and some that we're also continuing to develop on how the form can be best utilized. Obviously, we don't want to create a 20-page form, but it is important to also let clinicians know if there's psychological evidence, where does it go in the form? Where does that belong? If you have a child survivor, how do you tailor the documentation to also meet that child's needs and to capture the harm that they suffered? And so that is another area in DRC that we've been really developing. And as we've been doing these trainings, what we've been finding is actually that networks are emerging. These really collaborative and multi-sectoral networks are emerging out of every workshop that we do, essentially, of cohorts of these multi-sectoral professionals that are then able to ask questions about the evidence, to think about what was being presented, and actually to be able to follow up on cases specifically. So just this is a little here, I think, this is on Ukraine. So similarly, drawing on this experience, we've also been doing an assessment together with partners in Ukraine on documentation of torture and sexual violence. And again, really looking at trying to understand what exists, what's the pathway that's there, and how do we understand the challenges to documentation that occur, looking at the Istanbul Protocol, the Murad Code, and the International Protocol on Documentation of Sexual Violence and Conflict, all as very key touch points. And here too, if this report I think is useful in terms of really laying out a lot of the different ways that documentation can be hindered. Everything from, as Ranit shared, only allowing a very small subset of clinicians to do documentation can make it difficult for survivors. things like, I think in Ukraine, they only very recently have adopted their first standardized form. And that standardized form is really important, but for many, for a long time, they didn't have that form. And in the conflict, they've been really working hard to prioritize developing it, but it's been a challenge there as well. And so then that now working with that form, how do we build capacity? How do we train? And so that's been another intervention. And so one last area just to highlight is on technology. And so another piece that we've been trying to do is we've developed a mobile application called Medicapt, which essentially digitizes this type of standardized medical legal documentation form and allows it to be filled out by a clinician, to integrate forensic photography, and then to be passed through to the justice sector. And the idea here is actually that it helps secure the evidence better. It ensures that, right, there's just more, it's saved to the cloud, so it's not just a paper-based form that can get lost. But also that it employs things like skip logic, so it doesn't really allow clinicians to just skip questions, which leads, in our evaluations, we've found to more comprehensive documentation. And then being able to include photography, which we also train clinicians on how to use. This is also a really critical intervention. So we have evaluations of this mobile app. We have, I think, 5,000 records that have now been saved into Medicapt across the DRC and Kenya, where it's running across 5 different sites. So this has been a really exciting innovation and another way for us to think about how we overcome some of these challenges to documentation.
Thanks, Payal. It's actually really inspiring to hear just how far along we are along the path to really collecting best evidence. We all know that there's dozens, scores, 100+ global conflicts going on, conflicts around the globe, sorry. And it's hard to sometimes see the light at the end of the tunnel when there's so many atrocity crimes. I spent a long part of my career reporting on Syria and the escalation of violence there and the collapse of the peaceful protest movement and the descent into, a civil war that the president had basically instigated, and the vast amount of torture going on there was just, and the deaths of colleagues and things, that was part of the end of my career as a journalist, because I felt the futility of simply just reporting on this stuff. And for about 6 or 7 years, I didn't watch any news on Syria. Then I've leaped back into this world, retrained as a lawyer, and I've seen that actually there's always been this huge evidence gathering, and we don't have the justice cascade, perhaps, that academics have sometimes talked about, but I think we have an evidence cascade, and we see these trials now going on in Germany and France, and there's the first ever conviction of a Syrian official for torture as part of the crimes against humanity. And we certainly now have the tools, don't we, to gather the evidence. And I think that gives everyone fighting for human rights something to hold on to, amid the chaos and the often feeling of despair with just the way states are carrying on. We can all get together, lawyers, doctors, activists, journalists. So that's really quite inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing. And everyone can see in the chat box, there's lots of really important links there. You can just go to phr.org, and I think it's all on the website. I'd like to invite now our final speaker, if he's still there. He's coming in from Mogadishu, so I'm hoping the connection is still good. Dalmar, are you there? Can you?
Yes, yes, I can.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, we can hear
you.
You're appearing as a silhouette, though. Is that?
Yes, let me.
Is that what you wish?
No, it's not what I wish. It is the cloudy. And let me just say, 1 minute.
Sure.
Is it okay now? Is it better now?
Now your camera's off, I think.
Okay. It's okay now?
If you turn the laptop maybe towards the window so that you face the window.
Okay.
Well, perhaps we can ask some questions anyway.
Okay. So,
Dalmar, well, I mean, just tell us about the context in Somalia, because we know that sexual torture is a very serious problem in your
yes,
country.
absolutely.
But perhaps just give us the basic outlines. You know, who are the perpetrators, who are the victims and survivors, and then what's your role as the Somali Coalition of Human Rights Defenders?
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the microphone to take my opportunity to bring Somalia under the light. In Somalia, the perpetrators of sexual torture are divided into the following groups. One is the state actor, and others are non-state actors. The state actor that uses sexual torture is the National Security Agency called NISA, and this is because they use it as a tool to force victims of sexual torture into to make false confessions, so that they can be presented to a court proceeding that could lead to a double victimization of the victim, because they are already a sexual torture victim, and then court convicts them into what they have not committed. So the other main perpetrators include Al-Shabaab and also clan militias, and then their main purpose is to displace communities that are not welcome in their territories, or for a demographic change in their area of control. So they attack and make a mass sexual torture for example, on a small village where women and men are not indiscriminately raped. The same style as NISA is doing it with a different purpose. So our role as a human rights defenders is to monitor and report on the cases of sexual torture, and also deal with the victims, giving them a rehabilitation process, or admitting them into our rehabilitation center. The Coalition of Somali Human Rights Defenders has focal points in all regions in Somalia, and those focal points represent as a reporting point where we collect and document violations of sexual torture against the victims or alleged victims. Well, so we use Istanbul protocols and also the AU African Union Charter and Maputo Protocol. Those articles facilitate our work and make it more logic and in line with the standards, international standards, in terms of confidentiality and also documentation, as well as gender sensitive investigation and documentation and other relevant articles. So in Somalia, it's the problem is not only sexual torture as a problem. The problem is also lack of access to justice, because the country has been going through armed conflict through the last 3 decades, where most government institutions collapsed, and there is an ongoing state building in Somalia. So our Coalition of Somali Human Rights Defenders, we are doing a lot of efforts on different fronts. On the other front, we are taking the opportunity of the last UBR, Universal Periodic Review recommendations for Somalia, which recommended Somalia to ratify the Rome Statute and join the ICC. I know some people may argue that the ICC is not panacea, or it's not the main, the only solution. But in Somalia, we have already one practical solution for international justice, which was for the piracy. So the piracy was brought to an end by the international jurisdiction. So that's a good example of how this, how the international jurisdiction, the ICC, could actually be a game changer in the impunity that's decades age old in Somalia, and that needs to be ended and challenged through legal tools. So the perpetrators are emboldened by the impunity, and the victims continue to suffer a lot. Some of them lose their lives when they publicly speak because they have to face reprisals, targeted killing. Others have to end up in a prison that's never ending, and most of the time they die in the prison. Like, for example, in 2022, a journalist who was arrested, Abdullah Mumin, from the Somali Journalists in the Syndicate, has reported that he met a Somali teenager who was raped systematically as a sexual torture by Nisa in the prison, in a very notorious prison that's located in Mogadishu. And the main purpose was to force him confess or make false confessions to facilitate, to bring him to court, so that any sentence could be justifiable based on those confessions. So it's really this is what makes Somalia victims of sexual torture in Somalia more different, because of also of the environment, the political context, and the security, and other surrounding also factors that make them feel to be helpless and left alone and without voice. But we are happy that we remain to be the voice for the voiceless as human rights defenders. We always submit shadow reports that give voices to the voiceless, including sexual torture victims, and that could be seen on the UN sites. Our reports are there available. Anyone can find it at one click. So this is the situation in Somalia.
Thank you so much, Dalmar. I mean, as you outlined there, it's an incredibly difficult context in which you mentioned survivors who've spoken out have been killed, have been threatened. You know, they've been basically sort of buried in prison, long sentences. Can you tell us, have you been able to do any public advocacy around sexual torture and using documentation that you've done through your organization? I mean, do you have a survivor who has spoken out publicly about sexual torture, and how have you been able to secure them if you have so?
Most of the survivors of sexual torture who have spoken publicly, they didn't speak because they were in Somalia. They only spoke publicly when they left Somalia. Otherwise, they dare not to speak publicly inside Somalia, because they know the consequences is really loss of life, facing reprisal that amounts to targeted killing and other enforced disappearances, and also kidnappings. So we have had a lot of victims, but most of them spoke only when they left Somalia, and mainly women, because also there's a stigma, especially both for men and women, but for men it's even more catastrophic stigma if a man is raped. And it's not wished that a man should speak publicly if he's raped. I don't think so. But some men have done it, but they were not inside Somalia, and because they were in a secure and safe country somewhere in the world, and they were able to talk about their harrowing history and painful experiences they gone through, as well as also some other courageous women also did speak out publicly. And that was absolutely one of our main work to encourage if they can, because that voice that's coming out can be really alarming for the public. And some people among the public are not aware even that this is happening inside their country. So one voice that comes out is an alarming voice for the public, and that can absolutely lead to a change, to a policy change, to legal change, to other changes.
Thank you very much, Dalmar. Does anyone have a question for Dalmar in Mogadishu? I'm aware of the time, it's 4:35, so we won't be upset if audience members have to go off to other meetings, but we could continue for another 5-10 minutes, perhaps, if people have any questions for Dalmar.
I think Tahoe wants to raise his hand.
Dhayow, hello, from Malaysia. Nice to see you again.
And thank you for all the presentations, Dalmar. I just have a quick question. Help me to better understand the torture that's happening in Somalia. We do see the Somalia refugees in Malaysia, and we don't often talk to them because they don't always disclose torture histories. But of course, in the event where they start talking to us, could you help me to understand what are some of the common questions or what are the common areas that we should actually probe further so that we will be effective in our interviews to document the torture? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. That's very crucial question, and for your information, we had also another caseworker of an organization that's helping refugees in Malaysia that approached us some time ago about a young girl they were assisting in the refugee process. So my advice for you is that if it's a woman or man, you should try if they can speak English so that you can understand privately and you can interview them in a totally private area or room where there is no presence of any other person, so that that can give them the confidence to talk. And also the other thing to do is that if you are able to connect with a remote translator, Somali translator, who is not present or living inside Malaysia, who does not have any ties to Malaysia whatsoever, or doesn't know that anything about the victim, also this could be kind of helpful, so that the person can feel confident about what they are saying, and they can tell you about their histories.
Thank you, Dalmar. Thanks for that question, Dhayow. And the use of interpreters, I think, is another very, very important subject that, again, just to push the Istanbul Protocol, there are several sections and there's paragraphs of guidance, because lots of us have to use interpreters in our work, but getting the right interpreter who understands the field and understands how to do things, how to interpret, and how to be around survivors of torture and sexual torture is really, really important. We had a question, Mohammed Sadakat, from our member in Pakistan. Please go ahead, Mohammed.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the presentations and the discussions taking place over here. My question is about, we are just talking about the documentation of the sexual torture and sexual abuses. And I believe, and this is our experience, that unless the victim has shown the consent, the rehab activities and the rehab could not be activated. Right now, the service provider would be definitely helpless to provide any legal support, medical assistance, psychosocial support a victim or survivor needs really. And my question is that right now we are exposed to a similar situation. In one of the prisons of our working area, a senior officer was accused of raping a 20-year-old woman inmate. We have tried to get access to the women and her family, but basically they belong to the tribal culture, and talking about these things is hard, really. And they are not allowing us any access to the victim, and they are not going to disclose it to anybody else. Although the case is right now put in the court, and the man has been arrested, the senior officer of prison. Just guide us that how we can wade through the situation when the victim is not going to have these services we are every time ready to provide. Secondly, my second question is, there has been a 20-year war in Afghanistan, but we haven't learned about us even a single case about the Kosovo raids. Can somebody guide us that whether it was not happened or not properly documented? What was exactly the reason? These are my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Those are very serious questions, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer. Let me just summarize them. So a woman raped in prison, and the accused is a prison officer. The case is going to trial, but there's no evidence from her as the primary victim because she won't talk about it, and you can't access her to provide rehabilitation because you can't, the prison authorities won't give you access. And the question is how to proceed. I wonder if anyone in the panel or the audience can help. And then the second question, no cases of sexual torture arising from the 20-year-plus war in Afghanistan, as you see there in Human Development Organization in Pakistan. Can we think that sexual torture never occurred? I find that extremely unlikely. But can we say that there's a culture around complete silence? That could well be the case. But anyone who can provide more insights, please do jump in. No takers. It's well, you've done it, Mohammed. You've busted the webinar. It's a question that's for which there maybe is
really critical question.
There's no easy answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish our friends from Medical Action Group were here because they also work in prisons in the Philippines, and I know that they have the same kinds of difficulties that you have. I mean, all we can say is if a survivor is not willing to participate in an examination, as we said before, there's no way of compelling that person, and it's unethical to do so even in the presence of a court order as a physician, because it's, the primary duty is to the patient, to the client. We had one more hand up, did we, or has the hand gone down? In which case, in the absence of any more questions.
Hello.
Aha. Oh, and just to say, we've started our poll, which, if you can be kind enough to take, it really helps us with monitoring and evaluation, which is also part of my job here at the IRCT. So again, some self-interest in it. Please take the poll, answer freely. Yes, I heard a lady's voice.
Thanks very much, Hugh, for the presentation. For the concern about maybe, this is Mary from SCTV, maybe missing numbers about less numbers being documented. This could be partly due to the sensitivity of the concept, but also the culture around the concept of sexual torture, because normally someone can come in, give information about other kinds of torture, but take time without opening up about sexual torture. And this comes in later when some of the symptoms start to symptoms alluding to the torture, to the sexual torture coming up. That's when probably they can come in, but also coming to the concept of maybe individuals who need interpreters opening up. At times people fear their security, even them coming up to opening up in sessions where people from their countries are, also takes a long time because of the insecurities around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And that actually just reminded me of the final point perhaps I wanted to make, is that, oh, and I see Mohammed's very cute son there. That's sweet. But the point I wanted to make, obviously, that survivors of sexual torture are also survivors of torture and other ill treatment. And that perhaps, even though we're focusing on what the Istanbul Protocol and the other standards have to say about that very specific form of abuse, that there's so much that is very important to take in about the general documentation, the general questioning and examination of survivors. So please don't think you can read just that snippet of the Istanbul Protocol or other things and that would be it. And I would point you towards the parts around page 54, 55, paragraphs 221, which are very, very useful for best practice interviewing as a journalist, as a lawyer, and higher up the medical food chain of clinicians. Just these questions of where, when, how, please explain and describe what happened to you, and taking an account that lets the person speak uninterrupted, and then filling in the gaps. And I think there's some really useful guidance there in the Istanbul Protocol. So perhaps we should finish there, because now we've gone past 15 minutes over time. I thank you all very, very much for attending this webinar. We do have 2 more, I think. Yes, 2 more. And if you follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, you'll find the link to sign up for the next webinar. And please do also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Sound like a content creator now. And also subscribe to each other's social media channels and use the hashtag United Against Torture. And let's carry on building this strong movement for best documentation, rehabilitation, and justice for torture survivors. I bid thee farewell for now. I think next time you'll have Berta back, so it'll all be much, much better.
Phenomenal job. Thanks.
Goodbye, everybody.
Very much.
Thank
Take
you.
care,
Goodbye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for staying with
Thank you
us
so
this long
much.
time.
Bye,
Thank you,
Lisa.
Rita.
Bye.
Thanks to all the
Yes.
presenters. Awesome job.
Goodbye, everyone.
Important work.
Bye, everyone.
So important work.
Special
Take
thanks
care.
to all our panelists.